So far in this mini-series about manual exposure, we've answered some questions and clarified some myths surrounding the manual mode, and we've also looked at how important light is when it comes to determining the settings that we set. In this third and final part, we're going to see how our exposure triangle settings can help us to achieve the perfect manual exposure. Let's start off by looking at each of the exposure triangle variables in turn. And by variable, I just mean something that can be changed. So first of all, we've got aperture, which is the hole in your camera's lens that lets the light in. It can be opened and closed depending on the amount of light available and also your desired depth of field, i.e. how much of the photograph you would like in focus. If you'd like more information on choosing the right aperture, then refer to my video tutorial on that very subject. The link should be at the top of the screen right now. The second variable is shutter speed, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's basically how long our shutter opens to allow our sensor to be exposed to the light coming in through the camera. The third and final variable is ISO, which stands for International Standards Organization. Not that that's of any importance because it doesn't have any relevance to exactly what ISO is and does. ISO is basically the sensitivity of your camera's sensor. The higher the ISO level, the more sensitive your camera's sensor becomes to light. But the one thing to be careful of when it comes to ISO is the higher your ISO level, the more risk you have of getting digital noise, which is a grainy, pixelated look to your photographs. The exposure triangle settings are a bit like the glue that holds photography together. Not only do they help us to achieve the perfect exposure, they also help us to achieve the effect that we're looking for as well, whether that's a shallow depth of field or capturing movement in the fraction of a second. The way that they do that is by using a standard unit of light known as a stop in photography. Now most people think that stops just refer to aperture because they've probably heard on the grapevine the term f-stop. But stops refer to ISO and shutter speed as well and remain a standard across all three variables. In terms of shutter speed and ISO, stops are pretty easy to get your head around because basically we double the number each time as the stops go up in a scale. So from 50th of a second to 100th of a second would be one stop, 100th of a second to 200th of a second would be two stops, 200ths to 400ths and so on and so forth. And it's the same with ISO. So 100 to 200 ISO is one stop, 200 to 400 is another stop, and 400 to 800 is another stop, and so on and so forth. When it comes to aperture, it becomes a bit more tricky, because we're dealing with numbers with decimal points in them. So on the screen at the moment is a list of full aperture stops. What I recommend you do is note these down and learn them, because a lot of digital cameras these days have fractions of aperture stops, like 7.1 or 13, which can be really confusing and completely throw you when it comes to setting the correct exposure. So knowing these full aperture stops will really help you in the long run. So now we know what our exposure triangle settings do and how we measure them, it's time to put that together with what we learnt in the previous episode when we were looking at measuring light. Remember this graph, the exposure meter? Well, each of the points on this graph represent one whole stop. So from 0 to +1 and +1 to +2, and from 0 to -1 and -1 to -2. And each of the little gaps in between those numbers represent a third of a stop. So this is really useful when it comes to setting our exposure triangle settings, because we know if we're going to be either a stop overexposed or 2 stops underexposed or a third of a stop underexposed. It just gives us a bit more knowledge behind the settings that we're going to set to get the perfect exposure. Because our exposure triangle settings work together as a team, it means that we're going to have to invariably change one and then change the other two to fall into place. For example, if you want to achieve a shallow depth of field and open your aperture really wide, then invariably you're going to have to set a faster shutter speed to compensate for the more light coming in through the camera's lens. Alternatively, if you've got a really high ISO, then you can narrow the aperture down to lessen the amount of light coming in through the camera and still have a decent fast shutter speed. At this point, people normally ask me, well, which setting do you set first? Because it's a bit of a minefield. And it usually depends on what you're photographing. So, for example, if you're photographing something where you need a shallow depth of field, then I would set my aperture first, because the photograph revolves around that desired outcome. And if you want to photograph something fast happening at really fast pace, then I would set my shutter speed first, because again, the photograph is revolving around the amount of time needed to expose the photograph. I usually use my ISO as a standard, leaving it at a single level depending on the amount of light. Usually I recommend people leave it at the lowest it will possibly go to reduce the amount of digital noise on the photograph. But different cameras have different low and high ISO thresholds, so it's worth just having a play around to see what suits your camera best and setting it at that state. Before I run through a full example of what we've covered in all 3 parts to this manual exposure mini-series, I just want to address one more point about manual photography. And that is how we gauge if we've got the correct exposure once we've made a photograph. And you might think, well, that's obvious, isn't it? I just look at the photograph on the screen at the back of the camera. That's the beauty of the digital photography age. But unfortunately, it's not quite that simple, because the screens on the back of our cameras are really good liars. Because we can change the brightness of those screens, sometimes a photograph that is perfectly exposed can look underexposed, or a photograph that's overexposed can look absolutely spot on. Now, the way that we do this is by using the final graph that I'm going to talk about in this mini-series. It's called the histogram, and it's a digital representation of the zone system that we looked at back in part 2. On the far left of the graph, it represents shadows, and on the far right of the graph, it represents highlights. Now, a common misconception is that a good histogram shows a bell curve in the middle of the graph. But in reality, that'd be quite a boring photograph, because everything in between represents those midtones. So there'd be not really very much contrast in the photograph. It would just be a photograph entirely comprised of midtones. So what we're looking for is a nice even spread of peaks across the graph. It doesn't necessarily matter how high the peaks are, because that's just the intensity of the light and contrast within that area. The thing that matters the most is that we don't have the graph shifted to one side or the other, which means it would be either overexposed or underexposed. If the graph is pressed up right against one of those sides, it means that the detail in that area of the photograph has been lost. It's either in zone 0 or zone 10, and we call that clipping. I've now picked up my digital camera because I'd like to give you a live demonstration of all the steps that we've covered in the 3 parts of this mini-series so far. Now, because I can't get out and about to take photographs because we're all on lockdown, I thought I would just have to do it here at my desk. And what better subject to do it with than my trusty old manual film camera. I'm going to position that somewhere around there so I've got a nice decent angle on it. Now, the first thing that I need to do is set my camera's light metering mode. And because I'm photographing a reasonably close-up still life, I'm going to use spot metering. So I will change my camera to spot metering now. There we go. The next thing that I need to think about is the ISO level. And because I've got reasonably good light in this room, I'm going to set it as low as it will go, which on this camera is ISO 100. Now I need to think about the desired effect that I'd like from this photograph. And because behind my camera is my printer, which I don't really want to dominate the shot, I want a decent shallow depth of field. So I'm going to set my aperture to f3.5. The reason I'm not going wider than that is if I do go any wider, then I'm probably only going to get a fraction of my camera in focus, whereas I want the whole of the camera in focus, but throwing the background out. So now, what I'm going to do, using my camera's light meter, I'm going to point the centre of my camera's frame at one of the silvery areas on the camera, because for me that's sort of the mid-tone between the darker black of the camera and the bright white writing that we've got. And by doing that, I'm going to change the shutter speed and keep an eye on my exposure meter and try and get the exposure meter to align at the 0 point of the graph. And to do that, I'm having to just speed my shutter speed up slightly. So there we go, I'm going to fire off a shot, and miraculously, through the wonders of technology, that shot should now be on the screen. And as you will see, it's slightly underexposed. And as I said in part 2, there's always room for error when it comes to light meter readings. Because the camera is very dark and there's only a minimal amount of silver and white, what the camera meter reading has done is it's sort of not made up for that slight discrepancy in contrast, so it's made the photograph slightly darker than it probably should be. So to compensate, I'm going to refer back to that exposure meter graph and put my exposure meter graph to 2/3 of a stop overexposed, so towards the plus side of the graph. And I'm going to fire off another shot, and again the photograph should be on screen now, and you'll see that that looks pretty much spot on. The last thing I can do is to refer back to my camera's exposure on the histogram, and looking at that histogram, yes, it does look absolutely spot on. So as that goes to show, there's always room for error. So it does sometimes take a few shots to be able to get the correct exposure. But the more you do that, the more reliable the light becomes, and the more you can see the light with your own eye and be able to gauge that exposure a bit better. So instead of taking 2 or 3 shots once you first start, you get it down to just that one perfect exposure. The strides forward that have been made in photographic technology over the last 30 years is absolutely incredible. From manual film SLR cameras to the digital technology that we have today, it really is amazing to see how far we've come. Having said that, photography always has, and probably always will, revolve around those 3 exposure triangle settings of aperture, shutter speed and ISO. And it goes to show that if we learn how to use them properly, then we can pick up any camera and always achieve a decent result. It can be really tempting to go back to those automatic settings, thinking that manual photography is far too technical and advanced for me. But it goes to show that if we put in the effort and learn how to use these properly, then the potential of what we can photograph is absolutely endless. Hopefully, over the last 3 episodes, I've given you a basic knowledge of how manual photography works. You can now take that knowledge away and start putting it into practice. It will take time, but I promise you will get there eventually. And once you do, you'll have the world at your fingertips. Thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you again soon.